Hey, it's lyla.mev the Mini Witch, and it's time for Monster Bash 3, where I transform this WWE action figure into this Far Realms creature from your nightmares.
A bunch of friends and I got together and drew 5 random monster bits, mixed them all together, pulled 7 cards, and were assigned to use those cards as inspiration to sculpt, kit bash, and design our own unique monsters. Be sure to check out everyone else's monsters from the playlist in the cards. The cards I drew this time are interesting. A suit of armor, a toe, a tail, a vine, this mechanical arm, a long-fingered hand covered in blood, and this squiggle fin. Let's go over the plan. I'm thinking a humanoid transforming into some sort of Far Realms creature set in a cyberpunk future. Due to my love of D&D and inspiration from my suit of armor, I'm going with a Great Old Ones packed warlock who got more than she bargained for. The materials I plan to use for my model are foam, sci-fi toys from the dollar store, jewelry clasps, suede cord, and this action figure.
I'm also using green stuff, milliput, braided cord, fishing line, super glue, and wire as well. Lastly, the unsung hero of this project is UV resin.
My base is this WWE action figure. She is highly articulated, and I'm very pleased to see the realistic proportions of this figure. Let's get to work. I'm quickly removing the mold lines and the hair from my figure. The plan is to incorporate the fin into a mohawk, so I have to gain access to her scalp to create a smooth head for her hair to go onto. I might try to reuse her hair later, so I'm attempting to remove it without damaging it. And while I'm at it, I'm removing her head to make painting her face easier later. Next is the armor. My original plan was simple: find a cosplay armor online I like, sketch it, cut it out, then glue it to the model.
However, boy, was that not well thought through.
Instead of going over what didn't work, let's move on to what did. I stole this idea from the doll repainting sphere. I'm covering the chest with several layers of Scotch tape, then drawing the shape of the armor with a Sharpie. I'm loosely following the shapes of the first pattern I found to help accommodate for the curves of her chest. Don't redesign the wheel. If it worked for them, it will probably work for you. After the pattern is traced, I peel the tape away from the doll and cut the pattern following the lines. I'm only doing one side as I can flip the pattern and use it to exactly duplicate the other side as well. Next, I'm placing the pattern onto my model to double check that it fits. Then I cut this new pattern out of my craft foam 2 times, once for each side. The foam is applied to the figure by first sanding the plastic to give the glue some grip, then adhering the foam to the figure. I have to work very quickly and with precision, as the glue sticks immediately. After applying all the armor, including the shoulder pads, I'm using a braided cord to hide the seams of her breastplate. Next, I'm covering her head and filling in the gaps of her hips with milliput. Like green stuff, milliput is a 2-part epoxy that can be smoothed and shaped. I prefer milliput over green stuff because it can be sanded and is less expensive. The downside to using milliput is that it doesn't do tiny details as well as green stuff does. Epoxy takes 24 hours to dry, so let's leave it and come back to it tomorrow. Let's move on to the cybernetic parts of this project inspired by this mechanical claw. Using progressively larger and larger drill bits, I'm drilling several holes into her stomach, her arm, and 1 hole into her chest. Since I want to create an ovular opening in the stomach and forearm, I'm drilling multiple holes that can be connected with an X-Acto blade later to reach my desired shape. Next is sanding down the milliput and sharp edges on my model created from my X-Acto blade. Let's work on her insides. Since her body is hollow, I'm placing tinfoil inside to serve as a base, then topping it off with green stuff to create a smooth texture. On top of that is going twirly and wavy bits of wire to allude to her electronic interior. To finish the body, I'm adding her necessary accessories. Spikes on the pauldron of her armor, as inspired by the armor card, night vision binoculars at her thigh, and then a strap for the weapon she carries on her back. Lastly, it's time to give her a mohawk. I'm using the same braided cord and adding V-shaped bends so it looks like her hair grew organically. To allocate the space so the cable sit naturally in her head, I'm digging a groove into her head using an X-Acto blade and then widening it with a file. I'm then securing her hair with super glue and UV resin to hide the sharp edges of the groove I created. To set the hair, I'm flattening the hair to the head using a hair tie and then dunking the head into steaming hot water for 30 seconds and allowing it to dry. Let's add some tentacles.
I pulled 2 cards that were very similar. This vine as well as this tail tentacle thing.
But as you know, I settled on combining the two into tentacles. I'm using both milliput and green stuff for the tentacles. I'm rolling the epoxy into long snake-like tendrils, tentacles, and then draping them to the curving shapes I want. I know all these large tentacles will be coming out of her arm socket, but beyond that, I'm just making a variety of shapes and sizes. As my tentacles dry, I'm rolling out my spikes or thorns with green stuff, and then applying them later by using the sticky nature of soft green stuff to attach them to the tentacles.
This claw was gifted to me by a patron. You are amazing. Which means I didn't have this when I first started this project. And since I needed to start right away, I decided that I would go ahead without it and figure out how to incorporate the claw later.
Claw in hand, I'm placing 2 layers of flattened green stuff into the socket of the arm to give the illusion that this piece has been ripped out of someone's flesh. After letting the green stuff harden for 20 minutes, I'm taking my fingers and ripping at the edges of the epoxy to create that gross ripping texture.
So this is a toe. I wasn't entirely sure how I was going to put a toe into the story. I considered just having a random toe on the base, or maybe trying to cut part of her boots off and leaving her toes exposed. In the end, one of my patrons actually suggested that it looked like one of the helmets from Among Us, and that is something I could add to this diorama.
To get an approximate 2-scale helmet, I'm comparing tubular objects to the hair I ripped off my model earlier, then wrapping my chosen element in saran wrap. Using several layers of green stuff rolled to UV resin, I slowly create the glass needed for the helmet. For the fabric, I'm cutting off the corner of a plastic shopping bag and then tracing my glass onto the bag, then cutting it out to fit. Using hot glue, I'm then gluing the plastic to the resin. To hide the seams where the plastic bag and resin meet, I'm cutting a frame out of foam. Like any project, priming is the first step to a successful paint job. I'm using my Stylo-Res primer from Badger Air in gray as always. Next is painting the entire model a blackish purple. The plan is to do 2 sources of object source lighting, one from above and one from below. Since my gray primer could accidentally appear as a midtone, I'm covering the whole model in black so that the only midtones and highlights will be the ones created by my object source lighting I create through my airbrush. To create my OSL, I'm spraying white ink directly from above and directly from below, allowing each layer to dry before applying the next one. For vibrant colors like pink and teal to really pop, you need to paint them over white. Let's apply the pink. The vibrant pink paint I am using is very transparent, so I'm mixing in white to give it more opacity. After a few rounds of this, I move on to spraying my pure pink. As the light moves away from the source, the color becomes darker and less saturated. To blend into the purple shadow, I'm applying a darker pink by mixing my pink airbrush paint along with red and purple ink from scale 75. The teal is a mixture of blue and lime green ink with an addition of white paint. I angle the brush to shoot from below the model, again focusing on the feet and areas that are closest to the light source and allowing the paint to fall off towards her knees. Then I'm once again blending out my teal with a darker color. Lastly, I'm adding some of my pink airbrush paint to my teal mixture to create a purple and applying that color to blend my pink and teal together. I really wish I had spent more time on the airbrushing. Since I cut corners here, I will have to make up the time later by blending and intensifying my colors by hand. Back to tentacle time. I'm adding small tentacles poking out from her armor as well as her cybernetic areas. It would have been far easier and smarter to have done this before airbrushing, but honestly, none of this is done in the right order. Painting the face is one of my favorite parts, and I'm so excited to see the really detailed sculpt of this figure. I'm sculpting her face by shading the side of her nose, her temples, and the hollows of her cheeks, and highlighting the cheekbones and the bridge of her nose. I'm going in with alternating patterns of layering and glazing, continuing to push the highlights and shadows until I'm at a near black and white. If you would be interested in seeing a face tutorial, let me know in the comments below.
Yeah, good little marmalade. You gonna hang out while I work for a little bit? You are welcome to stay, but you know the rules. You're not allowed on the desk, and you have to let me paint. So as long as you agree to those rules, you can stay. Although it would be easier if you would sit so that I could get both arms on the table. Thank you.
As you can see, the foam didn't really take to the paint. Perhaps I should have sealed it with something before I started painting, so I'm going back over it again by hand. Not that painting it by hand is going any easier, as the foam loves to absorb paint. I am mimicking the same steps I did with the airbrush. A pastel pink for my highlights at the upturned parts of her body, a darker, more vibrant pink as it wraps around the sides, and purple in the shadows. Lastly, let's put her head back on and move on to the next part of the build. While we are done painting the main part of the model, there is still plenty left to do. I repeated all the same steps as last time. Primed, zenithal, pink from above, teal from below, faded the colors out so they blend better, done.
However, I am spending a lot more time on my airbrushing.
Last time I had banked on my airbrushing doing the work for me. However, because of the distance between my color gradients due to the size of the model, it didn't work out that way. Instead, I'm going back in with shades of pink, purple, and teal and blending everything together until the gradation is seamless. In short, I use my airbrush a lot like a paintbrush instead of some magic paint this automatically tool. With my cyberpunk theme going on, I needed a base that would be appropriate, preferably for as cheap as possible. My answer came in these pie tins from the dollar store. I like the somewhat industrial design they have on the bottoms, and that their thin metal material will make adding lights to them incredibly easy. However, this is a double-edged sword. While the flexibility does make poking holes through them very easy, it also makes warping the base just as easy. Due to the flexibility of the pie tins, I'm reinforcing them with hot glue and cardboard. Then it is done in the same manner, whether it makes sense or not. Primer, black paint, white ink over that. I'm painting my lightest teal or cyan color over my white ink. Then I'm adding darker lines between the holes where my light will slot in. As I spoke about earlier, light becomes less intense as it moves away from the source, so these darker colors will serve as that light fading off. Then I'm going over my lighter teal with white to give that intense highlight directly around my light.
After painting the base is done, I'm then slotting those lights into the holes I created in the base, and then using hot glue to secure them.
Finally, it's time for assembly. The tentacles are attached under the arm of my model with super glue. Then, using green stuff, I'm filling the cracks between my arms and the tentacles so they appear as one organic shape.
One of the things I was most excited about on this diorama was the blood splatter. You might have noticed that I applied blood splatter earlier and didn't mention it. That's because as soon as I finished applying it, I realized that was the wrong time to apply it.
For the base, I'm going back over my blood splatter and repainting it by hand. For the rest of my model, I'm loading up a toothbrush full of thin paint and then placing it in front of my airbrush and pushing down the trigger. Air through the airbrush creates a far more realistic spatter pattern than just flicking paint off the toothbrush. I also recommend adding gloss varnish to your blood mixture unless you're going to paint the highlights by hand. To give my blood a more three-dimensional look, I'm using UV resin to add depth and create droplets. The droplets are created by dipping fishing line in UV resin, holding it vertical so the resin pools on the end, then hardening it with my UV flashlight. Finally, I'm attaching the models to the droplet, again with UV resin. Finally, it's time to glue the monster to the base. I'm just using super glue and placing it on her tentacle, then applying her to the base. To attach the claw, I'm using UV resin. Lastly, I'm painting those blood droplets my vibrant pink to match the blood, and using a matte and gloss varnish as needed. Matte for the model, and gloss for the blood.
Thank you so much, Trent from Miscast, Luke from Nerdcraft HQ, and Raquel from Raxrex Arts for having me on the Monster Bash 3. Be sure to check out everyone else's builds, again, in the playlist in the cards. If you want to support me specifically, the best way that you can do that is to join me over on Patreon. Otherwise, you know the drill. Like, comment, subscribe, buy anything from Amazon using the affiliate links in my description, and I'll make a little bit of money. I hope that you guys are having an amazing Halloween, and I'll see you next time.